Well, welcome to Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and serve M&A as the Director of Ecosystem Development. Well, let me start off by admitting something that those who know me, it would come as no surprise. I'm a mess. On the outside, I could have my act together. I think I play competent pretty well, but despite 60 years of growth in both years and girth, I'm a work in process. Now, that causes no surprise in our circles. We just call it sanctification. You know, that work of God's free grace, whereby we are renewed in the whole man after the image of God, enabled more and more to die into sin and live to righteousness. What's true of me is true of each and every one of us. And when we gather together in the church, we bring all that messiness together. Now, whether we're gathering together physically, as we all do hope and pray will come someday soon, or virtually, it still is a problem. Now, should we not then always be considering what renewal or revitalization looks like in the whole body, the church? Now, often in the PCA, we love talking about church planting, beginning new works. Now, we need to talk about also what's the ongoing work of the church. What does that look like? What are the marks of church vitality? How do you assess the health of a church? Where does one go for coaching in this process? In other words, how do we free up leaders to be effective wherever God has placed them? Well, today we are talking about renewal, revitalization, seeing God's gracious hand in the work in our churches. And with us today is Erik McDaniel, pastor of Grace Presbyterian Church in Jasper, Tennessee. He has served there for 4 years. He and his wife Maggie have 6 children and 1 grandchild. Brad Jones is currently replanting a small PCA church in North San Diego County into a new plant called Arise Presbyterian Church. Brad has been a PCA pastor for 10 years and previously helped revitalize a PCA congregation in Calgary, Alberta. Brad is married to Kristen, and together they have 4 children. Well, welcome. Glad you are with us. Our other guest is supposed to be Matt Bohling. And I see Matt Bohling there. I'm going to move Matt to give him permission to talk. And more than that, Matt, are you there? I've given you permission to talk, which is something I don't often want to do, Matt.
I know it. It's trouble.
And now I'm going to promote you to be a panelist. We finally figured this out. Technology, of course, is a wonderful thing. So, Matt, there you are. We have
Woo!
Matt. Matt is a pastor with a passion for encouraging leaders to flourish in their calling. He coaches pastors and consults with churches on revitalization, strategic planting, church health, and pastoral search. He's the executive director of Flourish and is, I just saw Alan pop up. Married to Julianne. They have 4 kids and live in West Seattle, Washington. I am, though. Alan, we love you. I don't know how, did you get on with the Flourish thing? Yeah, you did. Okay, there we go. We can bring Alan on if we need to, but just trying to keep the panelists as it is. Well, this is great. Again, technology is a wonderful thing, and it aids in that sanctification as I sit here. And Matt, you'll know I was not saying or thinking any untoward thoughts towards you. It was about myself.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
It was me as the mess.
Yes, I'm sure.
As we get this conversation started, I'm going to throw out the first question, really, Matt, more towards you. There are a lot of terms that we use. Renewal, sure. Revitalization, whatever it might be. Are there terms what do the terms mean? Are they the same? Are they different? Or and I'll ask, Erik and Brad too, are the ones they prefer because of what they communicate? Just want to start with that broad question. Matt, would you help us out with that?
Unfortunately, the wonders of technology managed to completely distort your question.
Erik or Brad, did you get the question?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, why don't you run with it, and then Matt, you'll pick up what they're saying, and you can add.
Sure.
Go ahead, Brad.
Well, I think I've mostly used the term revitalization. I think that seems to be the more common term that's used, although it always takes explanation no matter what you're doing. So in my own current ministry, where it's kind of a verging towards replanting, I think the terms always require explanation. It's not so simple as, I think it varies in each context on what the church needs on the situation. So I use revitalization most of the time, but I think renewal and other words work as well.
What does revitalization mean to you? Why, I mean, can you flesh that out a bit more? Why is that intriguing?
I mean, obviously a church should always be growing and improving. I mean, that's what it means to be alive and be a church. But I think revitalization is acknowledging that something requires that sort of extra step of acknowledging that something has gone wrong. Something a little more dramatic is needed. It needs to be more intentional. Probably some of that could be avoided if there was sort of more of a focus on a low-level revitalization all the time. But for now, I think it's something a little more significant is required, and it requires an intentionality that churches don't always have. But that's something I'm sure Matt could talk more about if you're getting the question now. Let me off, Matt.
So Matt, renewal, revitalization, same, different. What terms do you think are helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, over the last several years that we've been having these conversations at the senior staff level with M&A, I think that one of the things that we've come to term, and I think it's helpful, is that church renewal should be an ongoing thing. So if sanctification, as you put it, Chris, is ongoing in the life of the believer, then sanctification for a church is ongoing renewal. Full stop, period. Always renewing, always reforming. I think that one of the ways that could be useful to talk about it is gradations, right? So if renewal is something that every church could be doing all the time, right? And we do that in the form of, at least as Flourish, we do that in the form of teaching churches how to do yearly strategic planning, a form of ongoing renewal, that you're always looking at what needs attention and reforming as you go, right? And then I think if you took it as gradation, so renewal is always, revitalization, I think as Brad put it well, is more severe, and maybe replant would be the most severe, right? That's a common way, I think, to think about the gradations in sort of maybe a bell curve, if you will, right? I don't know. That's helpful.
Okay, good. Erik, any your thoughts on that?
My brothers have said it quite well.
Sure.
I'm spot on with them.
You're going to go with that. Okay, no, good. Well, Erik, then would you just give us a little bit of your story? What's happening in Jasper? You've been there 4 years, and what does that whole process mean and look and feel like for you?
Yeah, no, thanks. First, thanks for even asking me. I don't think that our story is anything spectacular, other than through my own eyes it is. I would say it this way: I didn't start out looking to do revitalization or revitalization work. I was just looking to get close to family in like Chattanooga, Tennessee. But God opened up the doors for this to happen. My mom has said this, she's always said this about my ministry time. My mom has always used the scripture, Psalm 16:6, that says, "The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places." And the 5 lines that kind of set up the boundary that I get to minister in, my sending church in Alabama, they raised me, they nurtured me, they taught me, they sent me to seminary, they hired me back. They have loved me well, they counseled me. But my sending church in Anniston, Alabama, Faith Pres, was my first foundational line. The second one, obviously, is Grace Pres here in Jasper. Jasper is a small town, 3,300 people. It's a rural town. We are the furthest church in our Presbyterian West. We are in cow pastures, farmers. It is rural life at its finest. But the church that hired me in had dwindled down to 11 core people for whatever reason. But those 11 were faithful, and they were willing to risk. They literally were going to lock the doors on December 31st, 2015. And in October, God put us together like apple pie and whipped cream. It was fantastic. But we had no way to pay for it. They had no way to pay for it, but God provided this opportunity, and they are fantastic. The third border is my Presbytery, Tennessee Valley Presbytery. They literally put their money where their mouth was. They have financed us for 4 years, a portion of it. I have to raise my funds. I'm like a church planter / missionary. There's no real category that I'm aware of in the PCA for this revitalization, which I think would be helpful. But my Presbytery flat out said, this is what we're going to do. And they have put their money in where their mouth is, and they've sent people to me to make sure I'm okay. Furthermore, they said, we're going to help you, not leave you out on an island. You have to use this money to hire a coach. I said, I don't know who a coach is. They said, happenstance, there's a guy who's starting a coaching business who's transitioning named Matt Bohling out of Flourish. And so I got connected with him. It's been love at first sound. My fourth line is Jasper Highlands. It's a community that we never saw coming, that somebody built on a mountain behind our town. And it's a 55 and up community where people are coming in from all over the country, and they're trying to find new community and a church to connect with. And for some reason, somehow they've connected with us. But we never saw them coming because this town wouldn't have been able to sustain who I am, what I do with my family. And the fifth line is my family, particularly my wife. She was all in, heart, mind, soul. She said, I will follow you anywhere. Now listen, that meant she had to uproot 19 years in Alabama of relationships, of doctors, of comfortability. And she didn't hesitate. She said, I will follow you. We will go and we will minister. And so these are the 5 borderlines that I get to operate in. That's somewhat how it happened. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Brad, what's your story and what's going on there with Arise?
I was, I suppose I'll start way back. I was not raised in Reformed Church or in the PCA.
Well, thank you very much. Next question. No, sorry. I just had to interject that.
I was born in Western Canada and ended up going to college in the U.S. and found my way into the Reformed Presbyterian world and into the PCA by looking for a church that was Reformed and that was outreaching. And that's what I kind of saw in the PCA. So after seminary, I went back to Canada to serve as an associate pastor in a church in Lethbridge, Alberta. And then another church in our presbytery went through a horrible split and all kinds of trouble. They lost their entire session, maybe as much as 2/3 or more of the congregation. And I was, it's a long story. I can tell more about that, but eventually I accepted a call to go there as an interim pastor and then to serve as their pastor, which I did for 6 years. And it was quite a journey. And then as things were seemed like they were going really well there, it became clear that God was calling me and my wife, Kristen, to another calling, a small church we knew of from our time in seminary. I went to Westminster Seminary in Escondido, California. And nearby in Vista, there was a small church, Grace Covenant Church. And I learned that they had sort of dwindled down over the years. They were at about 15 to 20 people, mostly, a fair number retired and that sort of thing. And they were wondering about their future. They weren't quite at the point where they were going to close the doors, but, you don't have to, that church is not going to live forever like that. And so they made a huge sacrifice. I told them, I got connected with them and told them what I thought would be necessary, that they need to do a replant, which is, the most extreme form of revitalization, but it still has a ton in common with revitalization. And so we moved down here in July of last year, and we have been here about, 9-10 months, can't quite count. And we had our first and only pre-launch service 1 week before we had to shut down for this COVID-19 pandemic. And we were supposed to have had our public launch service on Easter Sunday. So we don't know what's going on, but but God has been working already, and I can share some more later. That I think even in this pandemic time is actually, I think, one of the greatest opportunities for revitalization. Like, let's pause and rethink some of what's going on in our churches. But anyway,
Okay.
that's my story. I'm married, 4 kids, etc.
Yeah, no, that's great. We'll get back to some of that. Matt, what stories and such are you seeing in this whole spectrum? We have, and any 2 people are just that, 2 people, 2 stories. They're great stories. What else are you seeing in the area that's exciting to hear?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I would say is that in terms of renewal, if I were to go the other end of the spectrum, a lot of times people think that, say, you're a church of 150 or 200 or 300, and it's all going well. You're not a tiny church. You don't need, replant or whatever. But what we're finding is that there are churches of all sizes that actually need renewal. And so some of the stories that are out there are churches that are still at 200 or 300, but actually their internal dynamics are still not good. They're not actually, the definition of a church on incline is that it's growing in ministry capacity. And there are a lot of churches that are much larger that is not their definition. If you look at their statistics, you look at their conversions, their baptisms of adults from non-believing backgrounds, you look at their development of leaders, and it's just not there. They're coasting on the fuel from previous generations of ministry. They're program reliant, they're not mission reliant. And so I think that one of the things that's exciting to see in the PCA is we're seeing renewal of congregations across size classes, which is exciting for me because I think that sometimes we can miss that churches of all sizes need renewal. And so anyways, that's fun for me to be able to observe.
All right, well, then let me throw a piece of red meat out and see which one of you want to jump on it. Really now, church planting is where it's at. Let's do a cost-benefit analysis of what we're going to pour, of the hours of the training you men have put into it. You'd be so much better served. Did not our Lord say, let the dead bury the dead and just move on? Once you guard your tongue.
I'd love to jump in there briefly.
Yeah, please. I'm throwing meat out there. I want to hear what because those thoughts can happen or are there, and I want to put voice to them, not because I agree, but I want to see how do you respond to that?
Yeah, and I've heard it, and I from people before, and it's an interesting question. But I'd say, first of all, the question is partly based on sort of a pragmatic view, right? Cost benefit and all that sort of thing. And it's not that there's no place for that in the church, but I would actually question even the pragmatic argument, because I have seen I'll speak for Canada, and I'm sure there's places in the United States where that's true. There may be places you can plant a church and it'll become, hundreds of people overnight. But planting a church from scratch is very difficult, and there's a high likelihood the church plant won't survive anyway. Mm-hmm. And so I think that when I see church plants struggling and how hard it is to get church plants off the ground, I wonder if the cost of trying to maintain an existing congregation, even if it were small, even if it's troubled, that still might be maybe even a better investment. But the cost thing aside, I believe so strongly that we have no right as God's people and as his church to write off our brothers and sisters in the church. So, one of the passages that stands out to me, there's a few of them, but very quickly, I'll just highlight, Jesus says that he came and a bruised reed he would not break, a smoldering wick he wouldn't put out. He's the shepherd who leaves the 99 to seek the one. I mean, that has to be our heart. And I think of the parable of the talents, and I've used this as I shared my calling a lot. In the parable of the talents, Jesus, the master gives out, 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent. And we usually just kind of think, okay, don't be this rascal one guy who buries the one talent. But I thought, doesn't that kind of apply a little bit in our church situations where we say, Lord, this one talent, this struggling church, they're probably just not worth it. So we're just going to bury them, literally. And Jesus comes back and he says, shouldn't I have received what is my own with interest? So he says, that little struggling church is my own. And who are we to say, you're just going to be written off? Now, I'm not going to say that there may be a time where churches do die or fold as a congregation, and that is necessary. But let that not be necessary because of our attitudes and negligence, but because of God's will. And maybe, if a church is unwilling to be helped, then that might be a problem too. But it just seems the gospel calls us to care for our brothers and sisters in struggling churches. Yeah. So that's all I'll say there.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, I'd like to add.
Anyone else want to jump on me?
Yeah. If I could add to that, I appreciate everything Brad said. I know that I had the privilege when I came here. Paul Hahn was the pastor of church planting and renewal in our presbytery. It was close to our presbytery's heart. I have benefited from that, and as what Paul, as the director of M&A, is trying to do, incorporating that. Believes this needs to be part of our denomination. It's not just planting, it's also renewal. But with Paul's close proximity and relationship with our church, before I ever came on the scene, he was coming out to our church, praying with the elders, evaluating, is this one where Jesus is snuffing out the candlesticks, or is it the smoldering wick he's going to breathe life back into and get the flame going? And there's a lot in our presbytery that had to interact with our session to say, wait, these guys know they are broken before the Lord. They have tried everything they can to bring people in, and people aren't, but they don't want to stop meeting. We already, in our situation, in a very Southern Baptist heavy environment, Reformed and Presbyterian, we got like 5 heads, and people look at us crazy already. We're not probably going to flourish in this environment based on doctrinal beliefs and such. So there had to be a belief in renewal, but they had to evaluate, is our church one that does need to be snuffed out, or is it one that, no, it needs to be tenderly dealt with? And they made a judgment call. We think they want to be dealt with tenderly. Having said that, it's sexy to plant a church. People want to give to that. There's, usually a 3-year promise of finances. I can make it 3 years, and I'll give a little bit less money each year. They're going to be on their feet. They're going to be going. Replanting or revitalization, especially in a rural community, it doesn't work like that. There aren't a lot of people drawn in here. Plus, theologically, we're a different place. There's just not a lot to necessarily grow a lot of people that gives money to sustain the ministry. So it's going to have to come from outside resources. I liken the illustration. I don't mean to be callous with this, but forgive me if this is inappropriate. But in adoption, and we've had the privilege to adopt several of our kids, we enjoy getting the new infant baby because we can shape the baby, we can pour our life into it, grow, all those things. It's hard to adopt a teenager because the teenager comes with baggage. The teenager comes with bad habits. There's a lot that comes with it. And so people are like, I don't know, that's a lot. And Chris, there's a part where you're right. Yeah, pragmatically, this does not make sense. We can put our money here and it's more fun, but there is something beautiful and lovely about caring. We're pro-lifers. We're not just believing about infants and little ones. Is life, all of life, and a church is kind of that way. So
yeah,
it's good.
Matt, I want to hear from you in a second, but I guess what I'm hearing, kind of as the outsider, is, while obviously it's not a competition of which is better, planting or doing renewal, but it is a sense we have built-in mechanisms to help encourage planting. We haven't thought that much on the other end. And what I'm also hearing too is there's a good hard work. You know, my question really assumes, let's push the easy button. Planting's not easy, but let's go with what, you know, we have the formula down for. When it comes to renewal, yeah, it's hard work, which is great. Yeah, Matt, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. One of the brothers, I'm not sure he's on today, but one of the brothers said in M&A leadership, when I first started talking to him about renewal some years ago, the functional definition had been, and I think this is not just our little circle, but I think that broadly speaking in America, and this has changed over the last decade, is it's less difficult to plant a church than renew a church. So let's just plant churches.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of the functional motto for a lot of years, right? Here's what I think it misses. It misses half the heart of Jesus and half the heart of Paul. Jesus is the one who says, you know, oh, stay with the 99, leave the one off. Don't worry about the one. No, that's not what Jesus says. You get a whole chapter of things that are lost to go find as parables.
Mm-hmm.
We can excise, well, you know, Paul's second missionary journey, that's unimportant. He didn't plant any churches there. We can excise all of Paul's letters and first part of Revelation, because that's all about struggling churches. So we can excise our New Testaments if we don't want to be concerned about church renewal, but that's really what a lot of it's about, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
It's about trying to help struggling churches that have lost their way. So I think that it's if we're going to be truly biblical churches, we've got to be about renewal. We have to be. There's no other way.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. We have a couple questions. I have a bunch more, but let's do with these questions, and those are listening in using the Q&A box. It's great, or use the chat box, or we're watching both. But Matt, there's a question here. How would you define successful renewal work in local church? What are the common threads in those successful stories for the church and for their leaders?
Yes, I'll give you a couple of things. One is our Church Renewal podcast has been going through a definition that Paul Hahn and I hammered over the last steps, and so you can go step by step and you can work your way through. Chris may read that later, but so you can hear much more than you'd want of Alan and I talking about that very question. Simply put, here's what I would say: it is much a renewed church is much more prayerful, and it's much more oriented towards the community and people that don't know Jesus. So it regains those dynamics that you build in as a church planter. Focus on the community, focus on evangelism, focus on relationships with unbelievers, and focus on prayer, right? Those core things have to get rebuilt back in. And when they are, that's moving towards a successful renewal. Those are the things where if we trust the same promise that God gave Paul, that I've got people here, that if we build relationships with the people that don't know Jesus, and we pray for their conversion, and we work towards being equipped to share the gospel in thoughtful, relevant ways to them, he's going to use that. Just like he does in church planting, we trust that he used it in renewal. That's my very short, way of putting it.
Okay, good. Thanks. There's a question here about, the kind of the gradation of renewal. Is there a litmus test or categories, Trevor asked, that would help congregation discern where they fall on that scale? What do you look for? What are the markers you have found? You guys in your works, Matt, as you've done the studies. Anyone?
Matt?
I know you have thoughts, Matt.
Well, I got thoughts about everything, right? And everybody knows that. I guess the one thing I would say is, what's the clock look like? So if you look at the trend line of giving, of particularly of worship attendance, of what's the morale of the congregation, I think that the lower those things are, the more severe the work has to be. That's the simplest way I think I would put it. Maybe there are other markers, but that's the way I'd put it, at least to start off.
I don't know if this is completely helpful, but I know I wasn't privy to all the conversations that Paul was having with our session whenever he came to have conversations with them. But what they have said and what he has told me also is he saw in the session, or the M&A committee of our Presbyterian saw in the session a willingness to let go of their idols, a willingness to say, listen, we've tried everything and people aren't coming in. We're open to what the Holy Spirit wants to have happen. If that means we shut our mouths, if that means we as a session each step down, we will do it. We believe that God started this work in Marion County, Tennessee, planted from Lookout Mountain Presbyterian Church in a different place because they were believers who wanted to have Reformed and Presbyterian worship. And so he saw their willingness to risk, their willingness to lay things down. Not, I say he like he's the Pope. I mean, he was the representative of the committee. But, and that was really, really helpful. And that has absolutely been my experience. So listen, they're like, you want to have a man bun or ponytail and preach in a robe? Go for it. We'll let you know if we think you're a hindrance to the gospel. A year ago when I said, hey, I think I would want to wear a collar. I've never worn a collar in my life. But for some reason, I sense that that might be helpful in our community to mark me as this is what you do. You're supposed to be helpful in the community. All those things. They were like, sure, you can try it. But if we think you're a hindrance to the gospel, we'll ask you not to wear it. Fine, that's great. They were willing to sell property that they were going to build a church building on in order to have money to pay me for a partial year's work. They were willing to do so much. And it was that brokenness, that willingness, that I guess if that's a litmus test, they pass with flying colors.
Good.
Let me throw one thing in, and I'll let Brad talk, because I want to hear what he has to say, because he had to test this church that he went to as well to know whether they would be open. So I think openness is a big deal. I also think way to put this, has the Spirit gone ahead of you going there? Now that's very touchy-feely for us Presbyterians. But if it's a work of the Spirit to plant a church, it's a miracle every time a church gets planted. It's a new miracle for a church to be renewed. So if it's a new miracle and you're going to go try and join in, has the Spirit gone ahead of you, right? And I think that's a critical question to try and answer.
Brad, any thoughts or?
Yeah, I think, the two works that I've been involved in now, one, of course, just starting, and the other in Calgary for 6 years. And that was a very different situation because it was a church that had a big, beautiful building. They still had, maybe 80 people or so when I got there. I've seen already that churches can be in such different circumstances. And I think there's churches that need revitalization or renewal because of leadership failure. There's churches that need revitalization and renewal because of just sort of a slow decline, but there's never been anything catastrophic in the church. So I think there can be very different circumstances. So I think there's probably value in making some categories, but it needs to be applied very individually. Just the way we would do pastoral counseling. But I think I like what Erik was saying about the involvement that other people had in the process. And I know I'm maybe jumping a little bit off topic here, but I think it's, aside from, criteria, I think it's pretty easy for us to look at, as in presbyteries and in the ministry, we can look at churches and say, that's a church that could use a little bit of help. And I think sometimes it's harder on the inside of a church to see that. And I think that involvement in the lives of other congregations, whether through the presbytery or exactly how that happens, would allow other people to see, I think revitalization is needed, because other people might see it before a session or even a pastor would themselves.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we're getting some questions here. David Wilson had one, and Erik has a response to it. So it kind of want to follow up on that, though. What are you looking for? If there's a try and fail, what do you look for in that congregation, in the leadership, that says this is a place we can try and fail, and they've been struggling. You know, it's not like try and fail, but they're actually succeeding. They just like that motto. They really have been hitting the wall. What's the leadership agility or the flexibility in the congregation that you see is important for this kind of work?
So good. My quick thought is, one, we have an older congregation and they're all grandparents by and large. And so they got grandparent eyes. They're able to be very flexible. Like, oh, honey, you spilled milk all over my great grandmother's, Persian rug. That's okay. We'll get that cleaned up. And they all have that ability to do that. And they've treated me not as a child, but with the ability that there's very little you can mess up. I attribute a lot of that to the guy who was here before me. He actually was never their pastor. They never hired him, one, because he wouldn't let him, but he was pulpit supply for, wait for it, 13 years. He didn't live in this town, but he loved this town. He loved these people. He still comes and visits us and visits people in the church. It is fantastic. But
Wow.
he tilled a ground that allowed people that said, let's try, let's risk. They tried outreach event after outreach event. People would come in, but crazily enough, in God's providence, a big family would join and then be transferred out to California. And so whatever they gained in size, it seemed like it just always dwindled back down. But what they may have lost in size, they didn't lose in the very fabric of who they were and what they were doing, which is willing to risk and try. So one of the things we've done since I've been here, hey, this is a renewal or a revitalization work. We have 7 empty buildings on our downtown square. It's where things used to happen, and now nobody's there. So we said, hey, let's revitalize a part of downtown. Let's move our church building. Let's congregate there. What would it look like? They went with me. We knocked on doors, and Jesus, through his Spirit, closed every door, one after the other. And we went, well, we got our answer. We're not doing that. And they said, so what's next? Maybe let's do a coffee shop. That didn't work. What's next? Well, we have this community college 1.7 miles down the road from us. Maybe we can get connected with them. Oh, and by the way, as we looked at this, what do y'all think about maybe hiring a second guy that you can't pay for and you can't still pay for me? And they said, yeah, I'll try it. I mean, it's like Mikey, let's give it to him. He'll eat anything. That's the way that this session has come across. It is fantastic. It's the fabric of this church. And we asked the guy to come join me, and he has to raise his own support. He's working part-time for us. It's crazy talk. And you got to be crazy. Brad will say, you got to be crazy to be in this, just like planting a church. There's an element in the planter or the revitalizer. You got to be crazy. But if you don't have a crazy session and churchgoers with you, it ain't going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That idea of crazy, Brad, is kind of what I was thinking when I heard your story. So you do it up in Calgary and go, let's do this again. So that's fantastic. So yeah, can you speak to some of that?
Yeah, well, I think it's true. Ignorance probably plays a little bit into it, but honestly, before I went to the church in Calgary, the PCA church there, I had at least one pastor in the Presbyterian who I deeply respected. And I think he was probably telling me what he should have been telling me. But he told me, do not go there. You're a young pastor, you're new in the ministry, like that is just horrible. And I went to the church because God closed some other doors, but I also, long story short, they had called someone who was potentially going to go there. And I told the interim session that was watching over the church, like, if he turns you down, then come talk to me. And then I prayed that this other guy would accept. And he didn't. So I said, well, I guess someone has to do it. I'll go. And the first 2 years were very difficult. In the church. It was so hard. And there were so many times I asked myself, what am I doing? This is horrible. And God really worked, and it changed. And I could talk a little bit more about that later, about culture change, which is really what was needed there. And I think after that experience, I thought, well, maybe God's training me for this or something. And what I'm doing right now is quite a bit different than what I did before. Before, it was a church that went through theological and in-church fighting and a split in which the entire session, pastor and elders, were voted out by the congregation as sort of like a scorched earth reset kind of thing. And they were divided as a congregation. Then half the people left, sort of, or not quite. In the church I'm in now, it's just a smaller church that kind of declined and maybe needed to have a refreshed vision and a renewed concern for evangelism, that sort of thing. So very different situations, but the common thread for me was just an absolute love of the church. And I said this off right before we got on the thing, but Erik and I have actually met before once, and that's when I saw his name on this panel list. I was like, I've met him before. We met at RPR, Review of Presbyterian Records, and for those who know that committee, you are only there if you love the church. Like, why would you go pour over minutes and read all this stuff and give up days of your life to, be some sort of slave, But you do that because you love the church. When I say the church, I don't mean your congregation. I mean the church. You see the big picture. And to really care about the struggling churches that are in this, like in Tennessee there, or the church I'm replanting here, you have to love the big church first, because that's what makes you see how valuable and treasured that little congregation is, or that maybe it's a big congregation, but it's just kind of a mess. And if you love the church and she's beautiful and you love her Savior Jesus, then, a church almost can't be ugly enough, or struggling enough for you to say, I don't care about that church. So, I love the church, and that's why I'm willing to go from place to place to place, or in these difficult circumstances. And I encourage others to do that. Like, we need more people. I'm also willing, and I guess maybe that's part of the criteria.
Yeah. No, that is good. Thanks. Larry Hoop asked a question, Matt, because you spoke about church growing in ministry capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Would you please elaborate? What do you mean by
so that's part of
people in the nursery volunteering for nursery, or
no. So I mean, it could be, but I think what it is that that's a phrase from a guy that I've learned a lot from. His name is escaping me right now, but it'll come back. But so the idea is that as a congregation, we are animated by response to the gospel, that we want to put our hand to the plow, and that we are willing to go do things again for Jesus. And a hard thing might be, I'm a grandmother. I've done my time with kids. I do my time with kids every week, but I'm still going to go work in the nursery. Or it means you are parents with young kids, and you're willing to sacrifice some of the evenings so you can go serve in a community ministry. You are a family, and it's busy, but the husband would be a really gifted community group leader, and you choose sacrificially to respond to the gospel of grace by giving that space and electing not to do other things. Growing ministry capacity is, we don't actively pursue the American dream. Our kids do less, they spend less, we leave more time for people that don't know Jesus, right? So everybody has capacity. It's what they choose to use it for. And a renewed church, the people are choosing to use their life capacity for the sake of the ministry of the church, in and out. That's a ministry capacity.
That's good.
Can I jump in there, Chris?
Yeah. Oh, please.
Because something Matt said earlier about how what you do in renewal or revitalization is you recover some of the strengths of a church plant that we always bake into a church plant. And that is absolutely true. Existing churches, large churches, or even a small church that just has, maybe they've got a lot of money in the bank and they can just exist forever, have the luxury of sort of forgetting our main purpose and forgetting the importance of reaching out and losing focus and starting to, expend all your energy on little debates about theology or fighting over the curtains or the carpet or the pews or whatever it is. Church plants know they can't do that. because it is grow and evangelize or die. And if you can get that same attitude back into a church of whatever size, then they will grow their ministries, but in a different way. And that's kind of what we're doing with this replant. That's what I did, helped encourage the church in Wood Green. You know, we need to change so that we're more welcoming. We got to rethink the language we use. I was very intentional in Wood Green about even the language that I use from the pulpit. Is it going to confuse people who are coming in? Will people see that, oh, I could invite my non-Christian friend to our service and he will have, or she will have some idea of what's being talked about. So you just start encouraging the church to think like a church plant, and it will change the way they focus their ministry and the energies that they have.
Thanks. Well, you know, we got about 15 minutes, a little less than that left. And so I would be remiss if I didn't ask a COVID question. It's got to come up somewhere in every conversation. And Brad, you mentioned a little bit, you were getting ready to relaunch and such. And again, there are a lot of the factors we talked about that's kind of somewhat universal or broad. In your context with revitalization, what are some of the things you have learned with respect to revitalization, and in light of what's happened over the last 2 months and what the coming months may or may not look like? And anyone?
I can jump in there briefly about this unusual situation derailed, so to speak, our relaunch as a Rise.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of think of our church plant as sitting on the launch pad, like the space shuttle, failure to launch or something. And but you know what? I actually am so thankful to God for this time. I realize I'd like to think we've done a lot of things right and that sort of thing, but boy, oh boy, have we had an opportunity to pray in these last few weeks like we hadn't been doing before. Like a lot of the practical stuff has been sort of put on pause. And now it's praying, it's talking about things. The session and I have had opportunities to speak about things we probably should have been talking about, months ago, maybe even before I came down, and to sort of get on the same page. And that's why I believe every church should say, okay, God has put us on pause, and let's take this opportunity to reevaluate our ministry approach, what we're doing. There should be churches all over the PCA that are, working on revitalization right now, because you can do a lot of planning and thinking that it's hard to do when everything's running. For us, I don't begrudge this time period at all, because I'm sure we'll have challenges on the other end, and it is difficult for us, but it has made us more prayerful, more thoughtful. It's allowed us to sort of talk about things without them actually going on. Let's talk about how we pray, or how we're going to reopen as a church, or let's talk about how we're perceived by the outside world and what we do in ways that would be harder to do if we're just talking about who's doing communion and who's got nursery duty and that sort of thing. So I think it's a great opportunity.
Anyone else, just pertinent to your situation, that's helpful for others?
I'll say one thing real quick, just with the number of churches that we're coaching. One of the things is you find out what's actually necessary. The things you chose to keep and reinvent virtually are actually the essential things. It gives you more freedom to say, do we want to pick that back up again? Or do we not really need to? Is that really helping? Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it sounds then, just jump in there. It sounds like what you're saying is with a narrower bandwidth in these situations, you can't rely on, we've got enough funds and money to keep doing stuff we shouldn't be. Is that what I'm hearing?
Or even people in capacity, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So it enables us to like pare down and look at what's actually helping people make progress in their discipleship, right? And we're going to keep doing those things. But if it's not helping people actually make progress in discipleship, we felt very free to just dispense with it in this time, because we knew we couldn't pull everything off anymore. Yeah. And it gives you a freedom to look at what's a sacred cow and why is it a sacred cow and should it be slayed, right? And I think that is a really a great opportunity from the Lord for all of us to look at.
Good. Thanks.
And maybe I can say one more thing, and I don't know if this is, well, I'll just say it, but in my devotions recently, I was thinking about how the way Jesus was treated by the Jewish leaders, the religious people of his day. And I thought, there is a capacity in us to get so busy in church life and that sort of thing where we are not genuine believers anymore, but we can be running a church that looks reasonably functional. And in a time like this, where we see what is or isn't required, it's also a great opportunity for people to evaluate, is Jesus enough for me? Is God enough for me? I mean, I love the church. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't love the church. But when we are we can't go and just go through the motions at church anymore the way we're used to, it does, I think, force us to ask ourselves, do I still have God? Is the presence of Jesus through the Holy Spirit enough for me, as he has been for God's people throughout, generations of suffering and isolation and persecution and prison and everything else. So I think, hopefully churches and Christians take that time and say, let's evaluate our hearts and what's important too.
Yeah. As we're running down on time, I want to, from your guys' experience in all of this, and because I want enough time for Matt to talk about Flourish itself, we haven't been able to do that. What if you had a magic wand? What institutional changes would you want to see in our churches, our presbytery, our denomination, that renewal, revitalization, replanting would become a greater focus or interest, desire, that we would see that as a wonderful and special calling?
So the things that it would be two things with the magic wand. It would be that the presbyteries would put their heart, soul, mind. We have money set aside for church planting. I wish we had money set aside for revitalization works, because there are churches in our presbytery that have been around for a while that need financial support and emotional support and coaching support. And there was going to be a second part to that, but I apparently waved the wand over my head and made me forget. So can
I follow up on that, Erik, and say that's immediately what came to mind. And I hate to say it, but it's not just the matter of money. It's showing that the presbytery is the presbytery. If someone in our church was struggling, we would help them. And the presbytery's job is to help struggling churches. And I wish our presbyteries were more strategic, had funds set aside, and were looking for churches that need help. And by all means, be wise about it. Say to the church, all right, we're going to help you, but there's going to be some extra oversight, and we're going to, it's going to be painful too. It's not just free money and that sort of thing. But, there are other denominations that I know of that have like war chests built. And if a church is in trouble, they're able to respond, and they're prepared to support works long-term with funding, for pooled funding from the churches. And we don't really have any mechanism for that in the PCA that I'm aware of. And we need to be okay with the idea that churches may be not self-supporting forever, depending on their context. And those churches, I think, shouldn't have to have that stress of, constantly living on the edge of non-existence and at the mercy of maybe just one congregation, So I'd love to see a little bit more teamwork and pooling of resources in the presbytery. But that comes along with the relationships within the presbytery among churches. And if individual congregations need to know pastors of other churches and elders of other churches. So we need to start moving our elders and pastors around, visiting, hosting things, so that if there is crisis, that it's not just some alien presbytery that's coming in, they're the big bad guys. It's, this is Pastor so-and-so. We know him really well, and we've listened to him preach several times. He's come and done seminars for us. Like, let's build that relationship now, so that when there is the need for revitalization, that the presbytery is prepared with relationship and with resources to act quickly. So
Yeah,
that's
and I will say before Matt gives his talk about Flourish, the other thing I remembered was that not only the relationship, that we had categories in the PCA. I wish in the BCO, there's my magic wand. I want categories for this church is a revitalization. We have mission church. We have a plant. We're going to do a church plant. And then we have a particularized church. We don't have a category for what we necessarily did in Jasper, a revitalization work. That's like, oh, and here's assessment. And I think if we had that, we would be able to say, like church planters, go to an assessment to find out if they have what it takes to be a planter. You would have assessment on the denominational level to say this person could be a church revitalized person.
Great. And I think that is then, Matt, a good question to you. Are there any tools for assessing? And do you know of anyone that can speak to that?
I think you should ask.
There's a softball.
You should ask. There's a softball. Funny you should ask that.
You got
I think
3 minutes.
So I think that the literature on church renewal, and it's a broad and it's a growing literature, basically says churches tend to turn around. We can observe them when the right kind of person goes to the right congregation at the right time. The right person to the right congregation at the right time. So let's talk about 3 of those real quick. So the right person, yes, Flourish has developed a renewal pastor assessment. As far as we know, it's the first product to market to do that in a robust way. And so, yeah, people have been telling me I've been working on this for 9 years in the PCA. And it was one of the first things that was told to me is, what's the assessment? And now we have it, okay?
Great.
The second is that the right person, the right church. So church assessment, I saw a question from Jim Hatch or a comment to us as panelists. Yeah, churches need assessment. You need to know whether a church actually is worth pouring money into. And I don't mean to be crass. We all have heart for struggling churches where they're willing to repent. What Jesus says in those letters to the churches in Revelation, that is not a dead letter. That's still true. And if a church is not willing to repent, if it doesn't want to be oriented towards the community, they don't want to do evangelism, they just want to be comfortable for themselves, go be comfortable somewhere else. That's just not what we're after. And then I think the right time. There are churches where the guy would fit the context, the guy's qualified, the church isn't ready yet. There are places where, sadly, and I had to say this to a church last year, and it was horribly painful, that sometimes it's too far gone. There's not enough pieces to put back together again, and you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so it can be too early. Church isn't ready yet. It can be too late. And so I think that those are the kinds of questions that Flourish is trying to answer. So we do assessments and we do coaching. And it's our great privilege to walk alongside both church planters and renewal pastors in trying to see churches flourish in their communities. So that's what we do. We love it. It's a great privilege.
Well, thank you guys very much. This has been a great opportunity, and hoping to have, so what we're trying to do here is having these kind of conversations going on, because any one of us doesn't have all the answers, but being able to gather together and hear from each other and having an audience be able to post those questions is very important. And as we continue to think and talk about renewal and revitalization and what's involved, just thank you for the work. Obviously, if you have any other interest in this, contacting Matt Bohling with Flourish, and the email or the website is flourishcoaching.org. Yeah, .org. Okay, I didn't want to say flourishcoaching.org. And next week, we are going to be looking at the issue of summer internships, church planting internships. And there are 2 areas that are going forward with it, but they're going to be virtual internships given the situation we're in. But again, just as with what we're talking about here, we are positioned to rethink what we are doing and making best use of a bad situation, and also with the technologies we have to have virtual church planting internships. And so someone from another part of the country does not have to pick up and move, but they can engage with some good foundational training while they're in seminary and get to hear what God is doing in different regions of the country, the New England Church Planting Network and the Midwest Alliance as well. So join us for that next week, and we'll keep you up to date on some of the other conversations we'll be having moving forward. Again, we're all in the midst of flexing and seeking to be agile in this. And if you have any thoughts or interests, please let me know. Chris Vogel at ngpastors.com or cvogel@pcanet.org. Well, thank you. Lord bless.
Goodbye.